The year is 793 AD. Monks at Lindisfarne Monastery are beginning their morning prayers when dragon-headed ships emerge from the North Sea mist. Within hours, one of Christianity's holiest sites lies in ruins, its treasures stolen, its defenders scattered, or worse. This moment marks the beginning of what we now call the Viking Age. 4 centuries that would reshape the map of Europe, establish trade routes spanning continents, and create legends that still capture our imagination today. But the story you think you know about Vikings, the horned helmets, the mindless brutality, the simple raiders from the north, well, that's mostly Hollywood nonsense. The real story is far more complex, far more fascinating, and frankly far more brutal than any movie could capture. These weren't just pirates with better boats. They were explorers who reached America 500 years before Columbus, merchants who traded with Constantinople and Baghdad, political masterminds who founded kingdoms from Dublin to Kiev, and yes, occasionally, absolutely terrifying warriors who could make grown men wet themselves at the mere sight of their sails. If you're interested in how a handful of Scandinavian farmers managed to terrorize, trade with, and ultimately transform medieval Europe, you might want to stick around. And hey, if you enjoy deep dives into history that Hollywood got completely wrong, you might consider subscribing. We've got plenty more where this came from. The Viking Age didn't begin with a single dramatic moment, despite what the raid on Lindisfarne might suggest. It emerged from a perfect storm of circumstances in 8th century Scandinavia: overpopulation, improved shipbuilding technology, political fragmentation, and perhaps most importantly, a culture that had spent centuries perfecting the art of organised violence. These weren't desperate barbarians stumbling out of the wilderness. They were the products of a sophisticated warrior society that had been preparing for this moment for generations. To understand how Vikings became Vikings, we need to step back into the world they emerged from. Pre-Viking Age Scandinavia was hardly the frozen wasteland of popular imagination. It was a region of competing chieftains, established trade routes, and remarkably advanced metalworking and shipbuilding techniques. Archaeological evidence from sites like Vendel and Valskerde shows us a society already fascinated with martial excellence, elaborate burial rituals, and most tellingly, boats. The famous ship burials of this period weren't just showing off, they were rehearsals for what was coming. The Sutton Hoo ship burial in England, dating to around 625 AD, shows us that Germanic peoples had already mastered the construction of vessels capable of long-distance sea travel. But it was in Scandinavia where this technology reached its peak, producing the longships that would become the terror of medieval Europe. The longship, or langskip as they called it, wasn't just a boat, it was a revolution in military technology wrapped in wood and iron. These vessels were shallow-drafted, meaning they could navigate rivers as easily as seas, bringing Viking raiders deep into territories that had never seen seaborne assault. They were fast, manoeuvrable, and could be beached on any shoreline, eliminating the need for harbours or docks. Most terrifying of all, they were bidirectional. Vikings could retreat as quickly as they had arrived, making pursuit nearly impossible. But technology alone doesn't explain the Viking explosion. The real catalyst was demographic pressure combined with political opportunity. Scandinavia in the 8th century was experiencing a population boom that its agricultural base couldn't support. Primogeniture inheritance laws meant that only the eldest sons inherited land, leaving younger brothers with limited options: serve a rival chieftain, carve out new territories, or find wealth elsewhere. For ambitious young men with excellent boats and weapons, the choice was obvious. The first Viking raids weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully planned military expeditions targeting the weakest points in European defence. Monasteries made perfect targets because they were wealthy, poorly defended, and located in coastal areas accessible by ship. The monks had spent centuries accumulating gold, silver, and religious artefacts, while specifically rejecting the warrior ethos that might have protected them. It was like leaving a bank vault open in a neighbourhood full of professional thieves. Lindisfarne wasn't actually the first Viking raid. It was simply the first one that shocked the literate world enough to be extensively documented. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers described it with the kind of breathless horror usually reserved for natural disasters, calling it a warning from God and proof that the end times were approaching. This wasn't entirely unreasonable. From their perspective, seaborne raiders materializing out of nowhere to destroy holy sites did seem rather apocalyptic. The success of these early raids created a feedback loop that drove further expansion. Viking leaders who returned home with ships full of plunder could attract more followers, build larger fleets, and attempt even more ambitious expeditions. Success bred success, and within a generation, what had begun as opportunistic raiding had evolved into systematic campaigns of conquest and colonization. The geographic spread of Viking activity in the 9th century is honestly staggering when you look at a map. From their Scandinavian homeland, they pushed west to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America. They sailed south through the Bay of Biscay to raid the Iberian Peninsula and enter the Mediterranean. They travelled east down Russian rivers to establish trade routes with Constantinople and Baghdad. They conquered much of England, founded kingdoms in Ireland, and established major settlements from the Orkney Islands to the Ukraine. This wasn't random expansion. It was strategic, coordinated, and remarkably well organised for a supposedly barbarian society. Different Scandinavian regions specialised in different directions of expansion. Norwegians typically headed west to Scotland, Ireland, and the Atlantic Islands. Danes focused on England and the Frankish kingdoms. Swedes travelled east through Russia to the Byzantine Empire and beyond. These weren't competing efforts, but complementary strategies that maximised Viking influence across medieval Europe. The Eastern expansion is probably the most underappreciated aspect of Viking history, partly because it's the most complex, and partly because it challenges our mental image of Vikings as purely Western European phenomena. Swedish Vikings, called Russ by the Slavic peoples they encountered, established a trade network that stretched from Scandinavia to Constantinople, creating what was essentially a medieval multinational corporation based on fur, amber, slaves, and silver. The Volga trade route was a masterpiece of medieval logistics. Swedish traders would sail across the Baltic, portage their boats across Russian rivers, and eventually reach the Volga river system that led to the Caspian Sea. From there they could trade with Persian and Arab merchants, exchanging northern European goods for Islamic silver, Byzantine silk, and exotic spices. Archaeological evidence shows that 9th and 10th century Scandinavia was flooded with Islamic silver coins. Over 85,000 have been found in Sweden alone. But this wasn't just peaceful commerce. The same Vikings who established trading posts also founded the political entities that would become medieval Russia. The legendary Rurik, supposedly called in by Slavic tribes to bring order to their lands, established a dynasty that ruled Russia until the 16th century. Whether or not Rurik actually existed as described, there's no doubt that Scandinavian warriors and merchants played a crucial role in organising the early Russian state. The Dnieper route to Constantinople was even more lucrative and dangerous. Vikings would sail down Russian rivers, fighting or bribing their way past hostile tribes, navigating treacherous rapids, and eventually emerging into the Black Sea where the walls of Constantinople, the richest city in Europe, rose before them. Some came as raiders, others as traders, and many as mercenaries willing to fight for Byzantine gold. The Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard became the elite unit of the imperial army, composed primarily of Scandinavian warriors who had travelled the eastern route. These weren't desperate refugees, but professional soldiers attracted by the promise of steady pay, regular meals, and the chance to participate in the most sophisticated military machine of the medieval world. Harold Hardrada, who would later die attempting to conquer England at Stamford Bridge, spent years in Byzantine service, accumulating the wealth and experience that made him one of the most formidable rulers of his era. Meanwhile, the Western expansion was proceeding with equal ambition but different tactics. The Viking assault on the British Isles began with raids, but quickly evolved into systematic conquest and colonisation. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, still consolidating their power after their own earlier conquests, found themselves facing an enemy that combined superior naval technology with tactical innovations they couldn't match. The great army that invaded England in 865 wasn't a raiding party, it was a migration with weapons. Led by figures who may have been the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, this force spent the next decade systematically conquering English kingdoms, establishing permanent settlements, and fundamentally altering the political landscape of Britain. They didn't just want to raid England, they wanted to replace its existing power structure with their own. The success of the Great Army established the Danelaw, a region of England where Scandinavian law, customs, and political structures took precedence over Anglo-Saxon traditions. This wasn't just military occupation, it was cultural transformation. Thousands of Danish and Norwegian settlers established farms, founded towns, and intermarried with local populations. The linguistic impact alone is remarkable. Hundreds of common English words have Scandinavian origins, including knife, sky, egg, husband, and they. Ireland experienced an even more dramatic transformation. Viking raiders first appeared in Irish waters in the 790s, initially focusing on monastery raids that yielded spectacular profits with minimal resistance. But they quickly realised that Ireland's political fragmentation offered opportunities beyond simple plunder. By establishing fortified bases at river mouths, they could control trade, extract tribute, and gradually integrate themselves into Irish political networks. Dublin, Cork, Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick all began as Viking trading posts and fortresses. These weren't temporary military camps, but permanent urban settlements that transformed Ireland from a rural, monastery-centred society into one with genuine commercial cities. The Vikings didn't just raid Ireland, they urbanised it, introducing coinage, establishing international trade connections, and creating the infrastructure that would support Irish economic development for centuries. The Viking impact on Ireland was so profound that by the 10th century many Irish kings were of partial Scandinavian descent, and Viking merchants were integral to the island's economy. The famous Brian Boru, celebrated as the king who defeated the Vikings at Clontarf in 1014, was actually fighting alongside numerous Viking allies against other Vikings and Irish rivals. The Battle of Clontarf wasn't Ireland versus Vikings, it was one coalition of Irish and Viking forces against another. The Frankish kingdoms experienced Viking pressure differently, but no less dramatically. The great rivers of Francia, the Seine, Loire, and Rhine, became highways for Viking raiders who discovered they could penetrate deep into the Carolingian heartland with relative impunity. Charlemagne's successors found themselves dealing with an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles, instead preferring hit-and-run tactics that devastated the countryside while avoiding decisive confrontations. The Siege of Paris in 885 to 886 demonstrates both Viking tactical sophistication and Frankish military limitations. Rather than attempting to storm the city's walls, the Viking army settled in for a systematic siege, building fortifications, establishing supply lines, and negotiating with different Frankish factions. They weren't mindless raiders, but strategic thinkers capable of complex military operations that required extensive planning and coordination. The Frankish response to Viking pressure eventually produced some of medieval Europe's most important political innovations. The development of feudalism as a military system was partly a response to Viking mobility. If centralised armies couldn't catch the raiders, perhaps decentralised networks of fortified positions could contain them. The construction of bridges, fortified towns, and regional strongholds transformed the Frankish landscape, creating defensive systems that would define medieval European warfare. But the most significant Frankish response to Viking pressure was political rather than military. In 911, King Charles the Simple granted Rollo and his followers territory around Rouen in exchange for military service and a promise to defend against other Viking raids. This wasn't capitulation, it was a sophisticated political manoeuvre that transformed enemies into allies. The Vikings became Normans, and within a century they would be among the most powerful military forces in Europe. The transformation of Vikings into Normans is one of history's most remarkable examples of cultural adaptation and political integration. Within 2 generations, Scandinavian raiders had become French-speaking knights, adopting Christianity, feudal law, and the military technologies of their former enemies. They didn't just assimilate, they excelled, becoming more French than the French while retaining the military prowess and political ambition that had made their ancestors so formidable. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was, ironically, the final great Viking achievement. William the Conqueror was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, and his invasion of England employed tactical principles that would have been familiar to 9th century Viking raiders. Superior naval logistics, rapid movement, concentrated force applied at the enemy's weakest point, and to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. But 1066 also marked the end of the Viking Age in a broader sense. Harold Hardrada's defeat at Stamford Bridge, just 3 weeks before the Norman victory at Hastings, represented the failure of the last great traditional Viking expedition. The old model of raiding and conquest was becoming obsolete, replaced by more sophisticated forms of political organisation that the Vikings themselves had helped to create. the reasons for the end of the Viking Age are as complex as the reasons for its beginning. Technological advantages that had made Viking raids possible were disappearing as other European societies adopted similar shipbuilding techniques and naval strategies. Political consolidation in England, France and Germany created stronger defensive systems capable of coordinating responses to Viking attacks. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity eliminated some of the cultural barriers between Vikings and their targets, making integration more attractive than conquest. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking success had created new opportunities that made traditional raiding less attractive. Why risk dangerous voyages to steal wealth when you could earn it through trade, mercenary service, or political participation in the kingdoms your predecessors had helped to create? The great Viking families of the 11th century were more likely to be found in royal courts than on longship decks. The Atlantic expansion represents the Viking Age's most adventurous chapter, even if it ultimately led to historical dead ends rather than permanent conquest. The settlement of Iceland, beginning in the 870s, was a remarkable achievement in its own right. The successful colonisation of a large uninhabited island, using medieval technology and agricultural techniques. But it was also a dress rehearsal for even more ambitious voyages. The Icelandic settlement wasn't random. It was organised, systematic, and surprisingly successful. The settlers, primarily Norwegian chieftains fleeing political consolidation under Harald Fairhair, brought with them livestock, farming equipment, and most importantly, the legal and cultural institutions necessary to create a functioning society. The Althing, established in 930, was one of the world's earliest parliaments, demonstrating that Vikings were capable of sophisticated political innovation when military conquest wasn't practical. Iceland's success enabled the discovery and settlement of Greenland around 985, led by Eric the Red, who had been exiled from Iceland for reasons that probably seemed compelling at the time. The name Greenland was early medieval marketing. Eric wanted to attract settlers to what was obviously a challenging environment, but the settlement succeeded, establishing farms, churches and trading connections that would persist for nearly 5 centuries. The Greenland settlements pushed medieval European civilization to its absolute geographic limits. These were Europeans living further north and west than any Europeans had ever lived, maintaining connections with Scandinavia across thousands of miles of dangerous ocean, and somehow making it work for longer than the United States has existed. The archaeological remains of their farms, churches and workshops are testament to human adaptability and the Viking capacity for long-term strategic thinking. From Greenland, the leap to North America was almost inevitable. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson led expeditions that established temporary settlements in what is now Newfoundland, creating the first documented European presence in the Americas. The L'Anse aux Meadows site provides clear archaeological evidence of Viking settlement, complete with workshops, living quarters, and most tellingly iron-working facilities that proved these weren't just temporary camps. The North American settlements failed, probably due to a combination of hostile indigenous populations, supply line difficulties, and limited economic incentives. Unlike later European colonization, the Viking expansion to America occurred at a time when Europe itself offered plenty of opportunities for ambitious adventurers. There was no demographic pressure forcing Vikings to persist in hostile environments when easier targets existed closer to home, but the failure of permanent North American settlement shouldn't diminish the achievement. Using medieval technology, Vikings successfully crossed the Atlantic, established settlements in the Americas, and maintained them for several years. They accomplished this 5 centuries before Columbus, without the navigational instruments, financial backing, or technological advantages that enabled later European expansion. It remains one of the most impressive feats of exploration in human history. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity marks both the end of the Viking Age and the beginning of medieval Scandinavian kingdoms that would become major European powers. This wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual process spanning several centuries, complicated by political rivalries, cultural resistance, and the practical difficulties of evangelizing societies that had spent generations perfecting the art of war. The early Christian missions to Scandinavia were remarkably unsuccessful, partly because the missionaries fundamentally misunderstood their audience. Vikings weren't rejecting Christianity because they were particularly attached to their traditional gods. They were rejecting it because it came with political and cultural strings attached that threatened their independence and military effectiveness. The Christian emphasis on peace, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek was a hard sell to people whose entire social system was based on honour, revenge, and martial excellence. Successful conversion required political backing, which meant convincing Viking kings that Christianity offered advantages beyond spiritual salvation. The Christian kingdoms of Europe were wealthier, more politically sophisticated, and increasingly successful in their conflicts with pagan societies. For ambitious Scandinavian rulers, conversion became a way to access European diplomatic networks, trade relationships, and military technologies. Harald Bluetooth's conversion of Denmark around 960 was typical of how Christianization actually worked in Scandinavia. It wasn't a spiritual awakening, but a political calculation. By converting, Harald gained legitimacy with Christian rulers, access to European marriage alliances, and the organisational benefits of the Christian Church. The famous Jelling stones that proclaimed Denmark's conversion to Christianity were as much political propaganda as religious statements. The process was rarely smooth. Christian kings faced resistance from traditional chieftains who correctly understood that the new religion threatened their power base. Christian concepts of royal authority, supported by divine sanction and ecclesiastical organisation, were incompatible with the traditional Scandinavian system of competing warlords and elected kings. Conversion meant political centralisation, which meant that many traditional leaders would lose power and influence. Norway's conversion, under Olaf Tryggvason, and later Olaf II, Saint Olaf, involved considerable violence as Christian kings used force to suppress pagan practices and eliminate rival claimants to power. The traditional picture of peaceful Christian conversion doesn't match the archaeological and literary evidence, which suggests that Christianization was often imposed through the same methods Vikings had used for conquest: superior organisation, strategic violence, and political manipulation. Sweden's conversion was the most gradual and perhaps the most successful in terms of preserving social continuity. Swedish kings managed to adopt Christianity while maintaining many traditional practices and power structures, creating a synthesis that satisfied both Christian and pagan constituencies. The process took nearly 2 centuries, demonstrating that successful religious conversion required careful attention to local political and social conditions. The establishment of Christian kingdoms in Scandinavia transformed Vikings from medieval Europe's greatest external threat into integral parts of the European political system. Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish rulers began participating in European diplomacy, forming marriage alliances with other Christian dynasties, and contributing to pan-European military efforts like the Crusades. The descendants of Viking raiders became crusading knights, fighting to expand Christianity rather than to raid Christian territories. This transformation had profound implications for European development. Scandinavian kingdoms brought substantial military resources, extensive naval capabilities, and valuable trade connections to the broader European political system. The Baltic became a European lake rather than a Viking preserve, enabling the economic development of Northern Europe and creating the foundation for later commercial networks like the Hanseatic League. The impact of Christianity on Scandinavian society extended far beyond politics and warfare. Christian monasteries became centres of learning, preserving and transmitting both classical knowledge and Scandinavian oral traditions. The great medieval Icelandic sagas, which preserve much of our knowledge about the Viking Age, were written by Christian monks who combined scholarly training with intimate knowledge of pre-Christian traditions. The legal systems of medieval Scandinavia represent fascinating syntheses of traditional Germanic law and Christian legal principles. Rather than simply replacing pagan law with Christian alternatives, Scandinavian legal scholars created hybrid systems that incorporated the best features of both traditions. The result was legal codes that were often more sophisticated and practical than purely Christian or purely traditional alternatives. The economic transformation of Scandinavia under Christian rule was equally dramatic. The same organisational capabilities that had made Vikings such effective raiders were redirected toward peaceful economic development. Scandinavian kingdoms became major participants in European trade networks, exporting timber, iron, furs, and amber, while importing luxury goods, agricultural products, and manufactured items from across Europe. The development of medieval Scandinavian towns and cities reflects this economic transformation. Cities like Bergen, Stockholm and Copenhagen began as trading posts and royal fortresses, but evolved into major commercial centres that facilitated trade between Europe and the larger world. These weren't just Viking settlements that happened to survive. They were planned urban developments designed to maximise commercial and political advantages. The military evolution of Scandinavian kingdoms demonstrates how successfully they adapted to changing European conditions. The traditional Viking emphasis on naval warfare and rapid movement was supplemented with heavy cavalry, siege warfare, and the castle-building technologies that defined medieval European warfare. By the 12th century, Scandinavian armies were indistinguishable from their European counterparts in terms of organisation, equipment, and tactical capabilities. But Scandinavian kingdoms retained some distinctly Viking characteristics that gave them advantages in certain types of conflicts. Their continued emphasis on naval power made them formidable opponents in any conflict involving water, whether in the Baltic, North Sea or beyond. The Scandinavian capacity for long-distance expeditions, honed during centuries of Viking expansion, proved valuable in contexts like the Crusades, where logistical capabilities were as important as battlefield prowess. The Northern Crusades represent a fascinating fusion of Christian religious motivation and traditional Scandinavian expansion techniques. The conquest and conversion of the Baltic region was accomplished using methods that would have been familiar to 9th century Vikings: superior naval logistics, fortified bases, systematic colonization, and the integration of military conquest with commercial development. The difference was that 12th century Scandinavian rulers did all this with papal blessing and European support. The Teutonic Knights, the Sword Brothers, and other military orders that spearheaded the Northern Crusades relied heavily on Scandinavian naval support, local knowledge, and colonization expertise. The resulting conquest of the Baltic region created a European sphere of influence that extended from Finland to Estonia, fundamentally altering the region's demographic, religious, and political character. In many ways, the Northern Crusades completed the process of European expansion that the Vikings had begun 3 centuries earlier. The medieval Scandinavian kingdoms also played crucial roles in broader European conflicts, often as the decisive factors that tipped the balance between competing powers. Danish control of the Sound, the narrow waterway between Denmark and Sweden, gave Danish kings the ability to control access to the Baltic and extract tribute from all ships passing through. This wasn't just economically valuable, but strategically crucial, since it meant that any major European power needed Danish cooperation to operate effectively in Northern Europe. Norwegian control of the North Sea shipping lanes provided similar strategic advantages. Norwegian kings could threaten English trade, support or oppose Scottish independence, and influence the outcome of conflicts between England and France simply by controlling who could use the sea routes around the British Isles. The same naval capabilities that had made Vikings such effective raiders now made Norwegian kingdoms valuable allies or dangerous enemies for any European power with maritime interests. Swedish expansion into Finland and the eastern Baltic created the foundation for later Swedish imperial ambitions that would make Sweden a major European power during the 16th and 17th centuries. The organisational capabilities, military traditions and territorial ambitions that characterised the Swedish Empire all trace back to medieval developments that were themselves extensions of Viking Age expansion patterns. The cultural legacy of the Viking Age proved even more durable than its political achievements. The conversion to Christianity didn't eliminate Scandinavian cultural identity, but rather provided new ways to express and preserve it. The great Icelandic sagas, written during the 12th and 13th centuries, preserved detailed memories of Viking Age heroes, conflicts and achievements, while presenting them in literary forms influenced by Christian and classical models. These sagas weren't just entertainment, but serious historical and legal documents that preserved knowledge about land ownership, family relationships, and political obligations that remained relevant centuries after they were first composed. The Icelandic legal system relied on saga evidence for resolving disputes about property rights and family relationships, making these literary works integral parts of medieval Scandinavian legal and political systems. The artistic traditions of the Viking Age evolved into the distinctive Scandinavian styles that characterised medieval Northern European art and architecture. The wood-carving techniques that had decorated Viking ships became the stave church architecture that distinguished Scandinavian Christianity from its continental counterparts. The metalworking traditions that had produced Viking weapons and jewellery evolved into the distinctive Scandinavian styles that influenced European decorative arts for centuries. The linguistic impact of the Viking Age extended far beyond the Scandinavian languages themselves. Old Norse became the lingua franca of medieval Northern Europe, influencing the development of English, Irish, Scottish, French and Russian vocabulary. The legal, political and commercial terms that Vikings introduced into other languages often became permanent features of European legal and political discourse. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking Age established Northern Europe as a legitimate participant in European civilization rather than a peripheral barbarian region. The demonstration that Scandinavian societies could successfully compete with and eventually integrate into the broader European political system changed how Europeans thought about cultural boundaries, political possibilities, and the relationship between civilization and geography. The archaeological legacy of the Viking Age continues to reshape our understanding of medieval European development. Excavations at sites like Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in Denmark, and Kaupang in Norway reveal sophisticated urban settlements with extensive international trade connections, advanced craft production, and complex social hierarchies that challenge traditional narratives about medieval European development. The ship burials at Oseberg, Gokstad, and other Scandinavian sites provide unparalleled insights into Viking Age material culture, technological capabilities, and artistic achievements. These aren't just graves, but time capsules that preserve textiles, woodwork, metalwork, and organic materials that rarely survive in other archaeological contexts. The level of craftsmanship and sophistication they reveal has forced historians to reconsider their assumptions about medieval European technological capabilities. The runic inscriptions found throughout the former Viking world provide a unique window into medieval Scandinavian thought, belief, and daily life. Unlike most medieval European sources, which were written by clerics for political or religious purposes, runic inscriptions often preserve the voices of ordinary people, commemorating family members, recording business transactions, or expressing personal beliefs. They show us a medieval European society that was more literate, more commercially sophisticated, and more emotionally complex than traditional historical sources suggest. The genetic legacy of Viking expansion can now be traced through modern DNA analysis, providing scientific confirmation for historical and archaeological evidence of Scandinavian settlement patterns. Studies of modern European populations reveal clear genetic markers of Scandinavian ancestry in regions that historical sources identify as areas of Viking settlement. This isn't just academic curiosity. It provides independent verification for historical claims about the scale and geographic extent of Viking expansion. The most surprising genetic discoveries involve the Eastern expansion. DNA analysis of modern Russian and Ukrainian populations reveals substantial Scandinavian ancestry, supporting historical claims about the role of Swedish Vikings in founding the medieval Russian state. The genetic evidence suggests that the Scandinavian contribution to Eastern European development was even more significant than historical sources indicate. The Atlantic expansion has also left genetic traces that confirm and extend our understanding of Viking achievement. Icelandic and Faroese populations show clear genetic contributions from both Scandinavian and Celtic sources, supporting literary evidence about the mixed origins of Atlantic settlements. Even more remarkably, genetic analysis of modern Native American populations has identified possible Scandinavian genetic markers, suggesting that there may have been more extensive contact between Vikings and indigenous Americans than the archaeological evidence indicates. The economic systems that Vikings developed during their expansion created some of the medieval world's most sophisticated commercial networks. The combination of long-distance trade, systematic resource extraction, and political control that characterized Viking economic activity in regions like Ireland and England provided models for later European colonial development. The commercial techniques, administrative systems, and cultural integration strategies that Vikings developed were later employed by medieval European powers in their own expansion efforts. The monetary systems that developed in Viking Age Scandinavia represent remarkable innovations in medieval European finance. The standardization of silver weights and measures across the Viking world created a trade network that functioned effectively from Greenland to Constantinople. The development of credit systems, commercial law, and dispute resolution mechanisms enabled Vikings to engage in complex commercial transactions that spanned continents and required long-term planning and coordination. The urban development that Vikings initiated in regions like Ireland and England established precedents for medieval European city planning and administration. Cities like Dublin and York became models for urban development throughout Northern Europe, demonstrating how strategic location, commercial infrastructure and political organisation could be combined to create successful urban centres in regions that had previously been purely rural. The technological innovations that emerged from Viking expansion had impacts far beyond Scandinavia itself. Improvements in shipbuilding, navigation, and maritime logistics developed during Viking voyages were adopted by other European maritime societies and contributed to the later age of exploration. The organisational techniques that enabled Vikings to coordinate complex military and commercial expeditions influenced the development of medieval European administrative systems. The political innovations that Vikings developed in response to the challenges of ruling conquered territories provided important precedents for medieval European political development. The integration of Scandinavian and local legal traditions, the development of administrative systems that could function across cultural boundaries, and the creation of political institutions that balanced central authority with local autonomy all influenced the evolution of medieval European political systems. The military innovations that emerged from Viking warfare had lasting impacts on European military development. The tactical use of naval power in support of land operations, the development of rapid deployment techniques, and the integration of raiding and conventional warfare all influenced medieval European military thinking. The professional military organisations that Vikings developed evolved into the medieval European military orders and professional armies that characterised later European warfare. The cultural exchange that resulted from Viking expansion created one of medieval Europe's most important periods of intellectual and artistic development. The contact between Scandinavian, Celtic, Slavic, and other European cultures that Viking expansion facilitated produced new forms of art, literature, legal thinking, and political organisation that enriched European civilization as a whole. The religious developments that accompanied and followed Viking expansion contributed to some of medieval Europe's most important theological and institutional innovations. The integration of traditional Scandinavian religious practices with Christianity produced distinctive forms of medieval European Christianity that influenced the development of Christian doctrine and practice throughout Northern Europe. The legal traditions that emerged from the interaction between Scandinavian and other European legal systems created some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated legal codes. The combination of Germanic customary law, Christian legal principles, and practical administrative experience produced legal systems that were often more equitable and effective than purely traditional or purely Christian alternatives. The educational developments that accompanied the Christianization of Scandinavia contributed to medieval Europe's intellectual revival. The preservation and transmission of Scandinavian oral traditions, combined with Christian scholarly methods, produced some of medieval Europe's most important literary and historical works. The educational institutions that developed in medieval Scandinavia became centres of learning that attracted scholars from throughout Europe. The technological developments that emerged from the interaction between Scandinavian and other European societies contributed to medieval Europe's technological advancement. The combination of Scandinavian practical knowledge with European theoretical understanding produced innovations in metallurgy, agriculture, construction, and manufacturing that spread throughout medieval Europe. As we reach the end of our journey through 4 centuries of Viking history, it's worth reflecting on how completely these people transformed not just their own society, but the entire trajectory of European development. When Vikings first appeared in European waters in the late 8th century, Europe was a fragmented continent of competing kingdoms, limited trade networks, and restricted horizons. By the time the Viking Age ended in the 11th century, Europe had become an interconnected political and economic system, with global ambitions and the organisational capabilities to pursue them. The Vikings didn't just raid Europe, they created it. The political boundaries, trade networks, urban centres, and cultural institutions that defined medieval Europe all bear the marks of Viking influence. The very concept of Europe as a coherent civilization, rather than a geographic expression, was partly a Viking creation, forged through 4 centuries of expansion, conquest, integration, and adaptation. But perhaps the most important lesson of Viking history is how quickly and completely cultures can transform themselves when circumstances demand it. The Vikings who terrorized medieval monasteries were the ancestors of the crusading knights who fought to defend Christianity. The raiders who burned Lindisfarne were related to the scholars who preserved classical learning in medieval Iceland. The pirates who demanded tribute from Frankish kings became the Norman nobles who created some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated political institutions. This transformation wasn't accidental. It was the result of a society that was remarkably adaptable, strategically intelligent, and willing to abandon traditional practices when better alternatives became available. Vikings weren't constrained by ideological rigidity or cultural conservatism. They were pragmatists who evaluated opportunities, adapted their methods to changing circumstances, and consistently chose effectiveness over tradition. The 4 centuries of Viking history demonstrate both the possibilities and limitations of medieval European development. Vikings achieved remarkable things. They crossed the Atlantic, established trade networks spanning continents, and created political institutions that lasted for centuries. But they also failed to establish permanent settlements in North America, couldn't maintain their Eastern European trade networks indefinitely, and eventually found that their traditional advantages were becoming obsolete. The story of the Vikings is ultimately the story of medieval Europe's transition from a fragmented collection of tribal societies to an integrated civilization capable of global expansion. Vikings were both the agents of this transformation and its products, shaped by the opportunities and constraints that medieval European development created, while simultaneously shaping those opportunities and constraints through their own actions. The 400 years we've examined weren't just a period of Scandinavian expansion. They were a crucial phase in the development of European civilization itself. The political institutions, economic systems, cultural traditions, and technological capabilities that enabled later European expansion all trace their origins, at least in part, to innovations that emerged during the Viking Age. Understanding Viking history means understanding how medieval European civilization actually developed, as opposed to how we might like to think it developed. It wasn't a peaceful process of gradual improvement guided by Christian virtue and classical wisdom. It was a violent, chaotic, opportunistic process in which success belonged to societies that could adapt quickly, fight effectively, and integrate successfully with their neighbours and enemies. The Vikings succeeded because they understood this reality and shaped their society to take advantage of it. Their descendants succeeded because they recognised when the rules of the game were changing and adapted accordingly. The societies that couldn't or wouldn't make similar adaptations, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Carolingian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, eventually found themselves marginalised or eliminated by more adaptive competitors. In the end, the Viking Age teaches us that historical success belongs not to the most virtuous societies, but to the most adaptable ones. The Vikings weren't better people than their contemporaries. They were more flexible, more opportunistic, and more willing to abandon comfortable traditions when those traditions became obstacles to success. This lesson remains relevant today, as we face our own periods of rapid change and uncertain futures. The 4 centuries of Viking history we've explored represent one of humanity's most remarkable examples of cultural adaptation, strategic expansion, and successful integration. From their origins as Scandinavian raiders, Vikings evolved into explorers, traders, colonizers, rulers, and ultimately integral participants in the European civilization they had initially threatened to destroy. Their legacy lives on not just in the genetic heritage of modern European populations or the archaeological remains scattered across former Viking territories, but in the political institutions, legal traditions, and cultural practices that continue to shape our world today. But let's step back from these grand historical conclusions and look more closely at how this remarkable transformation actually occurred. Because the devil, as they say, is in the details. And the details of Viking history are far more fascinating than any broad generalization could capture. Take the development of Viking shipbuilding technology, for instance. The evolution from the early boats of the Vendel period to the sophisticated longships of the 10th century represents one of medieval Europe's most important technological achievements. But it wasn't a sudden breakthrough. It was the result of centuries of gradual improvement, systematic experimentation, and practical learning that reflects a level of technical sophistication that challenges everything we think we know about medieval European capabilities. The Osberg ship, buried around 834 AD, shows us a vessel that was already the product of generations of refinement. Every element of its design, the shallow draft that allowed river navigation, the flexible construction that could handle rough seas, the symmetric design that eliminated the need to turn around, the retractable mast that could be lowered for stealth approaches, represent solutions to specific tactical and logistical problems that earlier generations of Scandinavian shipbuilders had identified and solved. But the really impressive part isn't the individual innovations, it's how they were systematically integrated into a coherent technological system that maximised strategic advantages while minimising operational costs. Viking longships weren't just boats. They were complex technological systems designed to project military power across vast distances with unprecedented efficiency. The logistics alone are staggering when you really think about them. A typical Viking longship required about 24 tons of oak timber, hundreds of iron nails and rivets, extensive rope and textile work for sails and rigging, and weeks of skilled labour by craftsmen who had to coordinate their efforts with remarkable precision. These weren't amateur efforts. They were sophisticated manufacturing operations that required extensive resource management, quality control, and project coordination. And then there's the operational complexity. Managing a crew of 30 to 60 men on voyages that could last months, navigating across open ocean without modern instruments, coordinating multi-ship expeditions across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, establishing supply bases in foreign lands. These weren't simple pirate raids, but complex military operations that required the kind of planning and coordination we associate with modern military organizations. The navigational knowledge that enabled these expeditions represents one of medieval Europe's most remarkable intellectual achievements. Viking navigators could find their way across the Atlantic using techniques that combined astronomical observation, weather pattern recognition, wildlife behavior analysis, and dead reckoning in ways that achieved accuracy rates that wouldn't be matched by European navigation until the development of the chronometer in the 18th century. The practical details of how they accomplished this are still being discovered by modern researchers. They used crystals to locate the sun through cloud cover, observed wave patterns to determine proximity to land, tracked migrating birds to identify seasonal navigation routes, and maintained mental maps of unprecedented accuracy and detail. Some of their techniques were so sophisticated that modern sailors using traditional methods still can't replicate their achievements. But perhaps most impressively, they developed these capabilities while simultaneously mastering the complex arts of medieval warfare, diplomacy, trade, and political organization. Vikings weren't just good sailors. They were good at everything they needed to be good at to survive and prosper in the violent, competitive world of medieval Europe. The military innovations that Vikings developed represent equally remarkable achievements in tactical and strategic thinking. The traditional image of Vikings as berserkers who charged mindlessly into battle is not just wrong. It's the opposite of wrong. Vikings were among medieval Europe's most disciplined, sophisticated, and strategically intelligent military forces. The shield wall formation that Vikings perfected wasn't just a matter of standing together with shields. It was a complex tactical system that required extensive training, perfect coordination, and battlefield discipline that could be maintained under the most extreme conditions. Archaeological evidence from battlefields like Stamford Bridge shows us the remains of formations that maintained their integrity even while being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The tactical flexibility that Vikings demonstrated in adapting their methods to different enemies and environments shows a level of military professionalism that rivals any modern military organisation. They could fight as heavy infantry against Anglo-Saxon armies, as mounted raiders against Frankish cavalry, as siege specialists against fortified cities, and as naval commandos in amphibious operations, often within the same campaign. The strategic intelligence that enabled Vikings to identify and exploit the weaknesses of their enemies demonstrates sophisticated understanding of medieval European political and military systems. They didn't attack randomly. They targeted specific vulnerabilities in their enemies' defensive systems, political structures, and economic foundations. The timing and location of major Viking raids consistently demonstrate detailed intelligence gathering and strategic planning that required extensive preparation and coordination. Take the Great Army's invasion of England in 865, for example. This wasn't a random attack, but a carefully planned operation that took advantage of succession crises in multiple English kingdoms, coordinated with existing political divisions within Anglo-Saxon society, and exploited specific weaknesses in English defensive systems that the Vikings had identified through decades of smaller-scale raids. The army's movements through England over the next decade show consistent strategic thinking that maximised political advantages while minimising military risks. They allied with local factions when possible, avoided decisive battles when outnumbered, exploited seasonal advantages in timing their campaigns, and consistently chose objectives that offered the greatest strategic value for the lowest cost in casualties and resources. The establishment of the Danelaw wasn't just military conquest. It was a sophisticated colonial project that required legal innovation, administrative expertise, and cultural integration on a scale that challenges everything we think we know about medieval European governmental capabilities. The Vikings didn't just conquer territory, they created new forms of political organisation that successfully integrated Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, political institutions and social practices. The legal codes that emerge from the Danelaw represent some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated attempts to create legal systems that could function effectively in multicultural societies. Rather than simply imposing Scandinavian law on Anglo-Saxon populations, Viking rulers developed hybrid legal systems that incorporated the best features of both traditions, while creating new institutions specifically designed to handle disputes between people from different cultural backgrounds. These weren't temporary expedients but permanent institutional innovations that continued to influence English legal development long after the Danelaw itself had been reconquered by Anglo-Saxon rulers. Many features of English common law trace their origins to legal innovations that emerged from the interaction between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon legal traditions during the Viking Age. The economic systems that Vikings established in their conquered territories demonstrate similar levels of sophistication and long-term planning. The transformation of Dublin from a fortified base into a major commercial centre required urban planning, trade network development, and economic policy coordination that rivals the achievements of much later European colonial projects. The development of coinage systems in Viking-controlled territories shows particularly sophisticated understanding of monetary policy and international trade. Viking rulers didn't just copy existing coin designs, they created new monetary systems that facilitated trade between regions, with different economic traditions, while maintaining the confidence of merchants who needed to know that their money would be accepted across vast distances. The standardization of weights and measures across the Viking world created one of medieval Europe's most extensive common markets. A merchant in Dublin could conduct business in York, Hedeby, or Kiev using standardized measurements and monetary values that were recognized and accepted throughout the Viking trading network. This level of economic integration wouldn't be matched in European commerce until the development of modern international trade organizations. But the really impressive thing about Viking economic systems is how they integrated military, political, and commercial activities into coherent strategic frameworks that maximized advantages across all three domains simultaneously. Viking raids weren't just military operations. They were intelligence-gathering missions that identified commercial opportunities. Viking settlements weren't just military bases, they were commercial centres that generated the wealth necessary to support continued military operations. Viking political arrangements weren't just governmental structures, they were commercial partnerships that facilitated trade while providing security for merchants and settlers. This integration of military, political and economic activities gave Vikings enormous advantages over enemies who tried to separate these functions. While Anglo-Saxon kings were trying to figure out how to pay for armies that could defend against Viking raids, Viking leaders were creating economic systems that generated the wealth necessary to fund continued expansion. While Frankish nobles were debating whether to fight or negotiate with Viking raiders, Viking commanders were establishing commercial relationships that would provide long-term economic benefits regardless of short-term military outcomes. The cultural achievements of the Viking Age are perhaps even more remarkable than their military and economic accomplishments, partly because they had to be accomplished simultaneously with all the other demands of expansion, conquest and settlement. Creating great literature, sophisticated legal codes, and innovative artistic traditions while simultaneously fighting wars, establishing colonies, and managing complex trade networks represents a level of cultural vitality that few societies have ever achieved. The Icelandic sagas represent one of medieval Europe's most important literary achievements, but they're also historical documents, legal precedents, and cultural preservation projects that served practical functions in medieval Icelandic society. These weren't just entertainment for leisure hours, they were essential components of Iceland's legal and political systems that preserved information necessary for resolving disputes, establishing property rights, and maintaining social relationships. The sophistication of saga literature challenges every assumption we might have about medieval European intellectual capabilities. These are psychologically complex narratives that explore themes of political ambition, family loyalty, personal honour, and social responsibility with depth and nuance that rivals the best modern literature. The authors of these works had to master not just literary techniques, but historical research, legal analysis, and political theory at levels that required extensive education and intellectual training. And they did all this while living in one of medieval Europe's most challenging environments, dealing with the practical demands of subsistence farming, international trade, and political organisation in a society that had no cities, no standing armies, and no centralised governmental bureaucracy. The intellectual achievements of medieval Iceland were accomplished by people who had to personally handle every aspect of economic, political, and social life, while simultaneously creating some of the world's great literature. The artistic achievements of the Viking Age demonstrate similar combinations of practical skill and aesthetic sophistication. The metalwork, wood carving, textile production, and decorative arts that Vikings produced weren't just functional objects. They were artistic statements that required mastery of complex technical processes and sophisticated aesthetic traditions. The level of skill required to produce objects like the Osberg ship carvings, the gelling stone decorations, or the intricate metalwork found in Viking graves represents artistic training and technical expertise that took years to develop and required access to extensive networks of knowledge sharing and skill transmission. These weren't amateur efforts by part-time craftsmen, they were professional productions by artists who had dedicated their careers to mastering their crafts. But perhaps most impressively, these artistic traditions continued to evolve and develop throughout the Viking Age, incorporating influences from across Europe and beyond, while maintaining distinctive Scandinavian characteristics that reflected local cultural values and aesthetic preferences. Viking art wasn't static traditional craft production, it was a dynamic, evolving artistic movement that responded to changing cultural conditions while maintaining its essential character. The religious transformations of the Viking Age represent some of medieval Europe's most complex cultural negotiations. The conversion from traditional Scandinavian paganism to Christianity wasn't a simple matter of replacing one set of beliefs with another. It was a gradual process of cultural integration that produced new forms of Christianity that incorporated many traditional Scandinavian elements, while fundamentally altering the social and political foundations of Scandinavian society. The practical challenges of Christianizing warrior societies that had spent centuries developing cultures based on honour, revenge, and martial excellence required theological innovations and pastoral strategies that had no precedent in Christian history. How do you convince people, whose entire social system is based on violence and competition, that they should turn the other cheek and love their enemies? How do you integrate Christian concepts of divine authority with traditional Scandinavian practices of elected kingship and competitive leadership? The solutions that emerged from these challenges created some of medieval Christianity's most distinctive traditions. Scandinavian Christianity developed concepts of divine sanction for warfare, Christian justification for territorial expansion, and theological frameworks for understanding honour and revenge that influenced Christian thinking throughout medieval Europe. The crusading movement, the concept of holy war, and the integration of Christian and warrior identities all owe debts to innovations that emerged from the Christianization of Scandinavia. But the conversion process also preserved many traditional Scandinavian values and practices within Christian frameworks. The emphasis on personal courage, loyalty to comrades, and acceptance of death in combat that characterized traditional Scandinavian warrior culture found new expression in Christian concepts of martyrdom, crusading, and religious warfare. The result was a form of Christianity that was distinctively Scandinavian while remaining recognizably Christian. The political implications of Christianization were equally complex and far-reaching. Christian concepts of royal authority supported by divine sanction provided Scandinavian kings with new sources of legitimacy and new tools for political centralization. But they also created new obligations and constraints that limited royal power in ways that traditional Scandinavian kingship had not. The establishment of Christian churches, monasteries, and educational institutions created new centres of power and influence that could support or oppose royal authority depending on political circumstances. The integration of Scandinavian kingdoms into broader European diplomatic and military networks provided new opportunities for political advancement, but also created new vulnerabilities and obligations that traditional Scandinavian political systems had never faced. The long-term consequences of these transformations shaped the development of Scandinavian societies for centuries beyond the Viking Age. The political institutions, legal traditions, cultural practices, and international relationships that emerged from the Christianization of Scandinavia provided the foundation for the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms that would become major European powers during the later Middle Ages. The demographic impacts of Viking expansion represent another fascinating aspect of this historical transformation that's only now becoming clear through advances in archaeological and genetic analysis. The scale of Scandinavian migration during the Viking Age was far greater than historical sources suggest, with implications for European demographic development that we're still discovering. Genetic analysis of modern European populations reveals Scandinavian ancestry in regions where historical sources mention Viking activity, but the extent of this genetic influence suggests population movements that were much larger than traditional historical accounts indicate. The settlement of England, Ireland, Scotland, and the Atlantic Islands involved substantial numbers of Scandinavian colonists, who established permanent communities and intermarried extensively with local populations. The eastern expansion appears to have involved even larger population movements. Genetic evidence suggests that Swedish Vikings established substantial settlements throughout the Russian river systems, creating communities that were large enough to have lasting demographic impacts on the regions where they settled. The role of Scandinavians in founding medieval Russian political institutions may have been accompanied by demographic changes that were much more extensive than historical sources suggest. Even more remarkably, genetic analysis suggests that some Viking expeditions may have included significant numbers of women, challenging traditional assumptions about Viking expansion as primarily male military activity. The establishment of permanent settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and the Atlantic Islands clearly required female settlers, but genetic evidence suggests that women may have participated in Viking expansion to continental Europe as well. The implications of these demographic discoveries extend far beyond simple population statistics. They suggest that Viking expansion was more systematic, more permanent, and more successful than traditional historical accounts have recognized. Rather than temporary military conquests followed by gradual assimilation, Viking expansion appears to have involved substantial population replacement and cultural transformation that had lasting impacts on European demographic development. The technological innovations that emerged from Viking expansion had consequences that extended far beyond military and naval applications. The organizational techniques that Vikings developed for coordinating complex expeditions across vast distances provided models for later European exploration, colonization, and commercial development that were employed centuries after the Viking Age had ended. The navigational techniques that enabled Viking Atlantic exploration were preserved and transmitted through European maritime traditions, contributing to the technological foundation that made later European oceanic exploration possible. The practical knowledge of wind patterns, current systems, and celestial navigation that Vikings accumulated during their centuries of oceanic travel provided crucial information for later European navigators. The shipbuilding innovations that Vikings developed influenced European naval architecture for centuries. The flexible construction techniques, shallow draft designs, and integrated sail and oar propulsion systems that characterized Viking ships were adopted and adapted by other European maritime societies, contributing to the technological developments that enabled later European naval expansion. But perhaps most importantly, the organizational innovations that Vikings developed for managing complex multi-year expeditions across multiple continents provided institutional models for later European expansion efforts. The techniques for establishing supply bases managing international trade networks, coordinating military and commercial activities, and integrating diverse cultural groups that Vikings developed were later employed by European colonial powers in their own expansion efforts. The intellectual achievements of the Viking Age extend far beyond the preservation of traditional Scandinavian culture in literary form. The scholars who created the great medieval Icelandic literature were also innovative thinkers who contributed to medieval European intellectual development in fields ranging from law and politics to history and geography. The historical works produced in medieval Iceland represent some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated attempts at objective historical analysis. The authors of works like Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla combined extensive research, critical analysis of sources, and systematic organisation of complex historical material in ways that established new standards for historical scholarship. These weren't just chronicles of events, but analytical studies that attempted to understand the causes and consequences of historical developments. The legal scholarship that emerged from medieval Scandinavia contributed to some of medieval Europe's most important legal innovations. The systematic analysis of legal principles, the development of procedural safeguards for legal proceedings, and the creation of appellate systems that characterized medieval Scandinavian law influenced legal development throughout Northern Europe. Many principles of modern European law trace their origins to legal innovations that emerged from medieval Scandinavian legal scholarship. The geographical knowledge that Vikings accumulated through their extensive travels contributed to medieval Europe's understanding of world geography in ways that influenced later European exploration and expansion. The practical knowledge of Atlantic geography, Arctic conditions, and North American territories that Vikings possessed was preserved in medieval geographical works and influenced later European exploration efforts. The political innovations that emerged from Viking expansion provided models for medieval European political development that influenced the evolution of European governmental systems. The techniques for managing culturally diverse populations, integrating different legal traditions, and coordinating complex administrative systems that Vikings developed were adopted and adapted by other European political systems. The economic innovations that Vikings developed had lasting impacts on European commercial development that extended far beyond the Viking Age itself. The standardization of weights and measures, the development of international currency systems, and the creation of commercial law codes that Vikings pioneered provided foundations for later European commercial development that remained influential for centuries. As we consider the broader implications of 4 centuries of Viking history, it becomes clear that we're not just looking at the rise and fall of a particular group of medieval European societies. We're examining a crucial phase in the development of European civilization itself, a period when the political boundaries, cultural institutions, economic systems, and international relationships that would define medieval Europe were established through processes that Vikings played central roles in shaping. The transformation of Europe from a fragmented collection of tribal societies into an integrated civilization capable of global expansion didn't happen automatically or inevitably. It required specific innovations in political organization, military technology, commercial systems, and cultural integration that enabled European societies to compete successfully with other world civilizations while maintaining internal cooperation and coordination. Vikings contributed to this transformation not just through their specific achievements, but through their demonstration that small technologically advanced societies could successfully compete with much larger and more established civilizations through superior organization, strategic thinking, and tactical innovation. The Viking example provided a model for later European expansion that emphasized technological superiority, organizational efficiency, and strategic intelligence over simple numerical advantage or resource abundance. The political techniques that Vikings developed for establishing and maintaining control over conquered territories provided precedents for later European colonial development that remained influential long after the Viking Age had ended. The integration of military conquest with commercial development, the establishment of legal systems that could function in multicultural societies, and the creation of administrative institutions that could coordinate activities across vast distances all became standard features of later European expansion efforts. The commercial innovations that Vikings developed provided foundations for European economic development that enabled later European global dominance. The creation of international trade networks, the standardization of commercial practices across cultural boundaries, and the development of financial institutions that could support long-distance commerce all contributed to European commercial capabilities that gave European societies crucial advantages in later global competition. But perhaps most importantly, the Viking Age demonstrated that European societies were capable of rapid cultural adaptation and strategic innovation when circumstances required it. The speed and completeness with which Scandinavian societies transformed themselves from raiding cultures to integral participants in medieval European civilization provided a model for cultural change that influenced European development for centuries. The lesson that emerged from 4 centuries of Viking history was that success in medieval European competition required not cultural purity or traditional stability, but adaptive capacity, strategic intelligence, and willingness to abandon traditional practices when better alternatives became available. This lesson became a defining characteristic of European civilization that enabled later European global expansion and continues to influence European development today. The archaeological discoveries that continue to emerge from former Viking territories provide ongoing evidence of achievements that historical sources have understated or ignored entirely. Recent excavations at sites throughout the former Viking world reveal levels of technological sophistication, commercial organization, and cultural achievement that challenge everything we thought we knew about medieval European capabilities. The discovery of sophisticated workshops, extensive international trade connections, and advanced technological systems at sites like Birka, Hedeby, and Dublin demonstrates that Viking commercial centres were among medieval Europe's most advanced urban settlements. These weren't primitive trading posts, but sophisticated commercial and manufacturing centres that coordinated economic activity across continental distances and supported populations that engaged in specialised craft production at levels of excellence that rival modern industrial capabilities. The ongoing analysis of ship remains from the Viking Age continues to reveal new information about Scandinavian technological achievements that exceeded what was previously thought possible using medieval techniques and materials. The engineering precision, material science knowledge, and construction techniques that these vessels demonstrate suggest that Viking shipbuilders possessed technical knowledge that wasn't matched by other European societies for centuries. The preservation of organic materials in Viking graves and settlements provides unprecedented insights into medieval European material culture, artistic achievement, and daily life that reveal levels of sophistication and comfort that challenge traditional assumptions about medieval European living conditions. The textiles, woodwork, leather goods, and metalwork preserved in these contexts demonstrate mastery of complex production techniques and aesthetic traditions that required extensive training and sophisticated cultural institutions. The runic inscriptions that continue to be discovered throughout the former Viking world provide ongoing insights into medieval Scandinavian thought, belief, and social organisation that reveal intellectual and cultural achievements that historical sources have failed to preserve. These inscriptions often preserve the voices of ordinary people expressing personal beliefs, recording business transactions, and commemorating family relationships in ways that show us a medieval European society that was more literate, more emotionally complex, and more intellectually sophisticated than traditional historical sources suggest. The genetic studies that trace the demographic impact of Viking expansion continue to reveal new information about population movements, cultural integration, and biological adaptation that provide scientific confirmation for historical claims while raising new questions about the scale and character of Viking expansion. The extent of Scandinavian genetic influence in regions like the British Isles, Iceland, and Eastern Europe suggests population movements and cultural integration that were more extensive and more permanent than historical sources indicate. As our understanding of Viking history continues to evolve through new archaeological discoveries, genetic analysis, and scholarly research, it becomes increasingly clear that the Viking Age represents one of medieval Europe's most important periods of innovation, expansion, and cultural development. The achievements of Viking societies in fields ranging from technology and commerce to law and literature established foundations for European development that remained influential long after the Viking Age itself had ended. The story of the Vikings is ultimately the story of how small peripheral societies can achieve disproportionate historical influence through superior organisation, strategic thinking, and adaptive capacity. The lessons that emerge from 4 centuries of Viking history remain relevant for understanding how societies succeed or fail in competitive international environments, how cultural change occurs in response to changing circumstances, and how technological and organisational innovations can enable small societies to achieve remarkable historical achievements. The 4 centuries of Viking history we've explored represent one of humanity's most remarkable examples of rapid cultural development, strategic expansion, and successful adaptation to changing historical circumstances. From their origins as Scandinavian raiders to their evolution into integral participants in medieval European civilization, Vikings demonstrated that historical success belongs to societies that can combine military effectiveness, commercial innovation, political sophistication, and cultural adaptability in coherent strategic frameworks that maximize advantages across multiple domains simultaneously. Their legacy continues to influence our world today, not just through the genetic heritage they left in modern European populations, or the archaeological remains scattered across their former territories, but through the political institutions, legal traditions, commercial practices, and cultural values that they helped to create and that continue to shape European and world civilization today. The Viking Age may have ended 1,000 years ago, but its influence on the modern world continues in ways that we're still discovering and learning to understand. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson of Viking history is that the societies that survive and prosper are not necessarily the largest, the richest, or the most traditional, but those that can adapt most quickly and effectively to changing circumstances while maintaining the core capabilities that made them successful in the first place. The Vikings mastered this balance between adaptation and continuity, between innovation and tradition, between local identity and global engagement. And in doing so, they created one of history's most remarkable examples of how small societies can achieve great things when they combine intelligence, courage, and strategic vision with the willingness to change when change is necessary for survival and success. But there's still so much more to unpack about the Viking world that we haven't fully explored. The individual personalities who shaped this remarkable period deserve closer examination, because behind every great historical movement are the specific people whose decisions, ambitions, and failures determined how events actually unfolded. Take Ragnar Lodbrok, whose very existence historians still debate, but whose legendary exploits captured medieval imagination so completely that they continue to influence political events centuries after his supposed death. Whether Ragnar was a real person or a composite of multiple historical figures, the stories told about him reveal important truths about Viking ambitions, methods, and values that shaped how later generations understood their own history and possibilities. The saga accounts describe Ragnar as a master of the spectacular raid, the kind of operation that combined military effectiveness with psychological warfare to achieve results far beyond what simple force could accomplish. His alleged attack on Paris in 845, where he supposedly extracted 7,000 pounds of silver from Charles the Bald, rather than actually capturing the city, represents the Viking strategy of using military threat to achieve economic objectives without the costs and risks of prolonged siege warfare. But the really interesting aspect of the Ragnar stories is how they reveal Viking strategic thinking about the relationship between military reputation and political power. According to the sagas, Ragnar's success came not just from winning battles, but from creating a reputation for invincibility that made enemies prefer to negotiate rather than fight. This wasn't just medieval psychological warfare, it was a sophisticated understanding of how military reputation could be leveraged into political influence that extended far beyond actual military capabilities. The saga accounts of Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Hubba, and others, provide even more revealing insights into how Viking political networks actually functioned. These weren't random raiders acting independently, but coordinated leaders who divided responsibilities, specialized in different types of operations, and maintained strategic cooperation across vast distances and extended time periods. Ivar the Boneless, in particular, represents a fascinating figure whose historical existence is well documented even if the details of his career remain controversial. His leadership of the great army that conquered much of England demonstrates strategic thinking that combined short-term tactical excellence with long-term political vision in ways that created permanent changes in English political development. The conventional interpretation of Ivar as a military commander doesn't fully capture his achievements. He was also a political innovator who created new forms of governance that successfully integrated Scandinavian and English institutions, a diplomatic strategist who manipulated existing English political divisions to maximize Viking advantages, and a colonial administrator who established systems of taxation, law enforcement, and resource management that enabled Viking settlements to prosper for generations. The archaeological evidence from areas under Ivar's control suggests that his administration was remarkably effective at promoting economic development while maintaining military readiness. The establishment of fortified settlements, the standardization of weights and measures, the development of craft specialization, and the creation of trade networks all point to systematic planning and administrative competence that goes far beyond simple military conquest. The contrast between Ivar's apparent success and the ultimate failure of Viking political control in England illustrates important lessons about the challenges of maintaining conquest over resistant populations. The Vikings could win battles, establish settlements, and even create effective governmental systems, but they couldn't solve the fundamental problem of demographic disadvantage that made their position inherently unstable over the long term. This demographic challenge was particularly acute because Viking expansion occurred at a time when European populations were generally growing, which meant that conquered territories could potentially recover from military defeats more quickly than the Viking settlers could reinforce their positions. The success of Viking expansion depended on maintaining technological and organizational advantages that were inherently temporary. Once other European societies adopted similar military technologies and governmental techniques, Viking advantages began to disappear. The career of Harald Hardrada illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of Viking strategic adaptation to changing European conditions. Harald represents the last generation of traditional Viking leaders, men who could remember when Scandinavian military superiority was unquestionable, and when Viking raids could achieve spectacular successes with relatively modest investments of resources and personnel. Harald's early career in Byzantine service demonstrates how some Vikings successfully adapted to the changing strategic environment by integrating themselves into the military systems of more powerful states. His service with the Varangian Guard provided him with experience in siege warfare, heavy cavalry tactics, and the kind of large-scale military logistics that traditional Viking warfare had generally avoided. He returned to Norway with both the financial resources and military knowledge necessary to compete effectively in the more sophisticated European warfare of the 11th century. But Harold's ultimate failure at Stamford Bridge in 1066 shows the limitations of even the most successful adaptive strategies. The English army that defeated him wasn't superior in individual combat skills or basic military technology. It was superior in organisation, logistics, and strategic coordination. The era when small forces of elite warriors could achieve disproportionate success through superior tactics and better equipment was ending, replaced by a period when victory belonged to societies that could mobilise larger resources more effectively. The irony of Harold's defeat is that it occurred just weeks before the Battle of Hastings, where William the Conqueror, himself descended from Viking settlers, successfully employed many of the same strategic principles that had made Vikings so effective in earlier centuries. The Norman conquest of England was, in many ways, the last great Viking victory, achieved by people who had successfully adapted Viking military traditions to the changing conditions of the 11th century European warfare. The Norman example demonstrates how Viking traditions could be successfully preserved and transmitted through cultural adaptation rather than simple preservation. The Normans didn't try to maintain traditional Viking culture unchanged. They integrated the best features of Viking military tradition with French feudal organisation, Christian institutional support, and Mediterranean commercial practices to create a hybrid culture that was more effective than any of its individual components. This process of selective cultural preservation and adaptation was repeated throughout the former Viking world, creating distinctive regional cultures that maintained important Viking characteristics while adapting to local conditions and opportunities. The result was a network of related but distinct societies that collectively preserved and transmitted Viking innovations long after traditional Viking culture had disappeared. The development of medieval Iceland provides perhaps the most complete example of how Viking cultural values could be preserved and developed through institutional innovation rather than simple tradition. The creation of the Althing as a parliamentary system that balanced individual rights with collective decision-making represented a sophisticated solution to political problems that traditional Viking societies had never successfully resolved. The Icelandic legal system that developed around the Althing demonstrates remarkable innovation in creating institutional mechanisms for resolving disputes without relying on centralized authority or military enforcement. The system of godor, chieftaincies, that provided political leadership without creating permanent power hierarchies represents one of medieval Europe's most interesting experiments in decentralized governance. But perhaps most importantly, the Icelandic preservation of saga literature created a unique historical resource that provides unprecedented insights into Viking Age society, culture, and values. The sagas weren't just entertainment or cultural preservation, they were legal documents, historical records, and political statements that served practical functions in medieval Icelandic society while creating literary works of remarkable sophistication and enduring value. The saga literature reveals aspects of Viking culture that other sources don't capture, particularly the psychological complexity and emotional depth of Viking social relationships. The portrayals of family loyalty, political ambition, personal honour, and social responsibility in works like Njal's Saga or Egil's Saga show us a society that was far more emotionally and intellectually sophisticated than stereotypical images of Vikings suggest. The female characters in saga literature are particularly revealing because they demonstrate the important roles that women played in Viking society despite the male-dominated nature of Viking military and political culture. Figures like Gudrun Osvifsdottir from the Laxdæla Saga or Halgerd from Njal's Saga are portrayed as politically influential, economically powerful, and personally formidable in ways that challenge assumptions about women's status in medieval European societies. The archaeological evidence for women's roles in Viking society supports and extends the literary evidence in fascinating ways. The ship burial at Oseberg, which contained the remains of 2 women along with elaborate grave goods, including a complete ship, textile working equipment, and domestic items, demonstrates that some Viking women held positions of considerable social and political importance. The presence of distinctly female grave goods in Viking burials throughout the expansion areas suggests that women participated in Viking expansion as colonists and settlers, rather than simply following male raiders after the fact. The genetic evidence we discussed earlier supports this interpretation, showing patterns of population movement that required substantial numbers of women to participate in the initial settlement phases. The role of women in Viking commercial activities appears to have been particularly important, with archaeological evidence suggesting that women often controlled textile production, food processing, and other economic activities that were crucial to Viking settlements' survival and prosperity. The standardization of textile production techniques and the sophistication of Viking clothing and household goods suggest that women's economic activities were far more complex and important than traditional historical accounts have recognized. The religious roles that women played in Viking society provide another fascinating glimpse into cultural practices that don't fit stereotypical images of Viking culture. The archaeological evidence for female religious practitioners, including what appear to be ritual specialists buried with distinctive artifacts and ceremonial items, suggests that women held important positions in traditional Scandinavian religious practices. The transition to Christianity created both opportunities and challenges for women's roles in Scandinavian society. While Christian doctrine generally restricted women's formal religious authority, the practical needs of establishing Christian institutions in newly converted territories often required women to take on roles that went beyond traditional Christian gender restrictions. The result was a complex negotiation between Christian ideology and practical necessity that produced distinctive forms of Scandinavian Christianity that incorporated many traditional elements. The preservation of traditional Scandinavian religious practices within Christian frameworks created some of medieval Europe's most interesting examples of religious syncretism. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Jelling complex in Denmark shows Christian symbols and traditional Scandinavian motifs integrated in ways that suggest conscious attempts to create unified symbolic systems that satisfied both Christian and traditional constituencies. The mythology that has been preserved through sources like the Prose Edda and Poetic Edda provides crucial insights into traditional Scandinavian worldviews that shaped Viking culture even after conversion to Christianity. The emphasis on fate, honour, courage in the face of inevitable death, and the importance of reputation that characterises Norse mythology helps explain the psychological foundations of Viking expansion and the cultural values that made Viking society so effective at organised violence and strategic risk-taking. The concept of Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world in which gods and heroes would fight a final battle against the forces of chaos, provides particularly important insights into how Vikings understood their place in history and their relationship to larger cosmic forces. This wasn't just religious belief, but a worldview that provided psychological frameworks for understanding and accepting the risks and uncertainties of expansion into unknown territories. The integration of mythological themes into saga literature demonstrates how traditional religious concepts continued to influence Scandinavian culture long after official conversion to Christianity. The psychological realism of saga characters often reflects mythological archetypes and moral frameworks that provided cultural continuity between pagan and Christian periods of Scandinavian development. The artistic traditions that preserved and transmitted mythological themes represent some of the Viking Age's most sophisticated cultural achievements. The carved wooden items from Oseberg, the metalwork decorations on weapons and jewellery, and the stone carvings that decorated churches and monuments all demonstrate artistic traditions that combined technical excellence with sophisticated symbolic content that required extensive cultural knowledge to fully understand. The development of distinctive Scandinavian artistic styles during the Viking Age represents remarkable cultural innovation that combined traditional Germanic decorative motifs with influences from across the Viking expansion areas. The interaction between Scandinavian artists and craftsmen and their counterparts in Ireland, England, France, and the Eastern Territories created hybrid artistic traditions that were more sophisticated and varied than any purely regional tradition could have achieved. The preservation of these artistic traditions in Christian contexts demonstrates how cultural adaptation could preserve essential elements of traditional culture while adapting to new religious and political conditions. The stave church architecture that developed in medieval Norway, for example, combined Christian architectural requirements with traditional Scandinavian building techniques and decorative traditions in ways that created distinctively Scandinavian forms of Christian expression. The influence of Viking artistic traditions on broader European artistic development is still being discovered and understood. The integration of Scandinavian decorative motifs into Romanesque and Gothic artistic traditions contributed to the development of medieval European art in ways that historians are still tracing. The international character of Viking expansion created artistic exchange networks that transmitted stylistic innovations across vast geographic areas with remarkable speed and accuracy. The technological innovations that emerged from Viking expansion had impacts on European development that extended far beyond military and naval applications. The metalworking techniques that Vikings developed for weapon production were also applied to agricultural tools, construction hardware, and craft production in ways that improved productivity across multiple economic sectors. The agricultural innovations that Vikings introduced to newly settled territories often represented significant improvements over existing local practices. The integration of Scandinavian farming techniques with local agricultural traditions in areas like England and Ireland created hybrid systems that were more productive and reliable than either purely local or purely Scandinavian alternatives. The urban planning innovations that Vikings introduced in the establishment of trading centres like Dublin, York and Hedeby created models for medieval European urban development that influenced city planning throughout Northern Europe. The integration of commercial, residential and defensive functions in compact, efficient layouts represented sophisticated solutions to the challenges of medieval urban development. The technological systems that Vikings developed for managing long-distance expeditions provided important precedents for later European exploration and colonial development. The techniques for establishing supply bases, managing multi-ship expeditions, coordinating activities across vast distances, and maintaining equipment and supplies in hostile environments were all innovations that later European explorers and colonists would employ in their own expansion efforts. The preservation and transmission of technological knowledge through guild systems, family traditions, and regional specializations created technological continuity that enabled Viking innovations to influence European development for centuries beyond the Viking Age itself. The shipbuilding traditions of the Scandinavian coasts, the metalworking specializations of particular regions, and the commercial practices of Viking trading centres all continued to develop and influence European technology long after traditional Viking culture had been transformed by Christianization and political integration. The linguistic impact of Viking expansion represents one of the most durable and far-reaching consequences of 4 centuries of Scandinavian expansion. The vocabulary that Viking settlers introduced into English, Irish, Scottish, French and Russian has remained integral to these languages for over a millennium, providing permanent testimony to the scope and depth of Viking influence on European cultural development. The English language in particular bears extensive evidence of Scandinavian influence at every level, from basic vocabulary to grammatical structure. Common English words like sky, knife, husband, they, are, and get all derive from Old Norse, demonstrating that Scandinavian influence on English wasn't limited to specialised terminology, but extended to the most fundamental elements of everyday speech. The grammatical influences that Scandinavian languages had on English are even more remarkable because they demonstrate extensive bilingualism and cultural integration between Scandinavian settlers and Anglo-Saxon populations. The simplification of English inflectional systems, the development of new pronoun forms and changes in word order patterns all reflect sustained contact between English and Scandinavian speakers that must have involved extensive intermarriage and cultural mixing. The preservation of Scandinavian place names throughout the former Viking territories provides a geographic record of settlement patterns that historical sources don't fully preserve. The distribution of place names ending in -by-thorp -toft and other Scandinavian elements creates detailed maps of Viking settlement that reveal the extent and character of Scandinavian colonization with remarkable precision. The legal terminology that Viking societies contributed to European legal development represents another form of linguistic influence that had lasting institutional consequences. Legal concepts and procedures that originated in Scandinavian legal traditions were incorporated into the legal systems of conquered territories and continued to influence legal development long after political control had changed hands. The commercial terminology that emerged from Viking trading activities became standard throughout Northern European commercial networks, creating shared vocabularies that facilitated international trade and economic integration. The standardization of terms for weights, measures, currencies, and commercial practices that occurred during the Viking Age provided essential foundations for medieval European economic development. The influence of Old Norse on other European languages varied depending on the intensity and duration of Scandinavian presence, but even areas with relatively brief periods of Viking control often retained Scandinavian linguistic elements that demonstrate the cultural impact of Viking expansion. The preservation of Scandinavian loanwords in languages throughout Europe provides evidence for cultural contacts and influences that other historical sources don't preserve. The literary influence of Scandinavian storytelling traditions on European literature represents another durable consequence of Viking expansion that continued to shape European cultural development for centuries. The narrative techniques, character types, and thematic concerns that characterize saga literature influenced the development of medieval European literature in ways that scholars are still discovering and analysing. The integration of Scandinavian historical traditions with continental European literary forms created hybrid literary traditions that were more sophisticated and varied than purely regional alternatives. The historical works of medieval chroniclers throughout Northern Europe show clear influences from Scandinavian storytelling traditions, demonstrating how Viking cultural contributions were preserved and developed within new cultural contexts. The scholarly traditions that developed in medieval Iceland created some of Europe's most important contributions to medieval learning and intellectual development. The systematic collection and analysis of traditional Scandinavian culture that scholars like Snorri Sturluson undertook represents pioneering work in historical methodology, comparative mythology, and literary analysis that influenced European intellectual development throughout the medieval period. The educational innovations that emerged from the integration of Scandinavian oral traditions with Christian scholarly methods created distinctive approaches to learning and knowledge transmission that influenced educational development throughout Northern Europe. The combination of practical knowledge, historical understanding, and literary sophistication that characterized medieval Scandinavian education provided models for educational integration that other European societies adopted and adapted. The astronomical and navigational knowledge that Vikings accumulated through their extensive voyages contributed to European understanding of geography, weather patterns, and celestial navigation in ways that influenced later European exploration and expansion. The practical knowledge of ocean conditions, seasonal patterns, and navigational techniques that Vikings preserved in their oral traditions provided crucial information that later European navigators relied on. The botanical and zoological knowledge that Vikings acquired through their settlements in diverse geographic environments contributed to European understanding of natural history and agricultural possibilities. The identification of useful plants, the development of new agricultural techniques, and the adaptation to different climate conditions that Viking settlers achieved provided valuable information that influenced European agricultural development. The geological and mineral knowledge that Vikings accumulated through their mining and metalworking activities contributed to European understanding of natural resources and extraction techniques. The identification of mineral deposits, the development of mining methods, and the refinement of metalworking processes that Viking craftsmen achieved influenced European technological development in ways that extended far beyond military applications. As we consider the comprehensive impact of 4 centuries of Viking expansion on European civilization, it becomes clear that we're examining one of history's most remarkable examples of how relatively small populations can achieve disproportionately large historical influences through superior organization, strategic thinking, and cultural adaptability. The demographic statistics alone are staggering when we consider what Vikings accomplished with limited human resources. The total Scandinavian population during the Viking Age probably never exceeded 2 million people. Yet these populations established permanent settlements from Greenland to the Ukraine, created trade networks that spanned continents, conquered major portions of the British Isles and France, and fundamentally altered the political development of medieval Europe. The efficiency with which Vikings converted human resources into strategic capabilities represents one of history's most impressive examples of organizational effectiveness. The ability to mobilize substantial portions of the adult male population for overseas expeditions while maintaining agricultural production, craft specialization, and territorial defense demonstrates social organization that was remarkably sophisticated and effective. The sustainability of Viking expansion over 4 centuries demonstrates strategic planning and institutional development that goes far beyond opportunistic raiding or temporary military success. The creation of settlement patterns that could be maintained over multiple generations, the development of economic systems that could support continued expansion, and the establishment of political institutions that could adapt to changing circumstances all required long-term thinking and systematic planning that challenges stereotypes about Viking impulsiveness or short-term focus. The cultural achievements that Vikings accomplished while simultaneously conducting military campaigns, establishing colonies, and managing complex trade networks demonstrate intellectual and artistic capabilities that few societies have matched under similar circumstances. The creation of sophisticated literature, the development of innovative legal systems, the production of remarkable artistic works, and the preservation of extensive historical traditions all occurred during periods of active expansion and cultural transformation. The technological innovations that Vikings developed and transmitted throughout their expansion areas contributed to European technological advancement in ways that influenced later European global expansion. The shipbuilding techniques, navigational methods, metallurgical processes, and organizational innovations that Vikings pioneered provided foundations for European technological development that remained influential for centuries. The political innovations that Vikings developed for managing conquered territories and integrating diverse populations provided important precedents for later European colonial development. The legal systems, administrative techniques, and governmental institutions that Vikings created demonstrated possibilities for political organization that influenced European political thinking throughout the medieval period and beyond. The economic innovations that Vikings developed created some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated commercial networks and financial systems. The standardization of weights and measures, the development of international currency systems, the creation of commercial law, and the establishment of trade networks all contributed to European economic development in ways that provided foundations for later European commercial expansion and global trade. The The social innovations that Vikings developed for managing culturally diverse populations provided important models for European societies that were themselves becoming more diverse and cosmopolitan. The techniques for cultural integration, the development of hybrid institutions, and the creation of shared identities that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries all influenced European social development in lasting ways. The religious innovations that emerged from the Christianization of Scandinavian societies contributed to medieval European Christian development in ways that influenced the evolution of European Christianity. The integration of traditional and Christian elements, the development of distinctive theological traditions, and the creation of new forms of Christian expression all enriched European religious culture and provided models for Christian development in other cultural contexts. The intellectual innovations that emerged from Viking expansion contributed to medieval European intellectual development in ways that influenced European scholarly tradition and educational methods. The historical methodology, legal scholarship, literary techniques, and scientific knowledge that Vikings developed and preserved provided important contributions to European intellectual culture that remained influential throughout the medieval period. In our final assessment of 4 centuries of Viking history, perhaps the most remarkable thing to consider is how completely these achievements were accomplished by people who were operating at the very limits of medieval European technological and organizational capabilities. Vikings didn't have access to technologies, resources, or institutional support that weren't available to their contemporaries. They simply used available tools more effectively and systematically than other societies of their time. The lesson that emerges from this comprehensive examination of Viking history is that historical achievement depends less on material advantages than on organizational effectiveness, strategic intelligence, and cultural adaptability. The Vikings succeeded not because they had better tools than their competitors, but because they used the available tools more systematically and strategically to achieve objectives that their competitors couldn't imagine or attempt. This lesson remains relevant today as we face our own periods of rapid change and global competition. The societies that succeed in contemporary global competition are not necessarily those with the largest populations, the greatest natural resources, or the most traditional cultural stability, but those that can adapt most quickly and effectively to changing circumstances while maintaining the core capabilities that make them competitive. The Viking Age demonstrates that small, technologically advanced, strategically intelligent societies can achieve remarkable historical impacts when they combine military effectiveness with commercial innovation, political sophistication with cultural adaptability, and local identity with global engagement. These lessons from 1,000 years ago continue to provide insights into how societies can succeed in competitive international environments where adaptability, innovation, and strategic thinking are more important than simple resource advantages. The 4 centuries of Viking history we've explored represent one of humanity's most remarkable examples of how strategic vision, organizational effectiveness, and cultural adaptability can enable small societies to achieve historical influences that far exceed what their demographic and resource base would suggest possible. The legacy of these achievements continues to shape our world today in ways that we're still discovering and learning to understand, providing ongoing testimony to the enduring significance of this remarkable period in European and world history. But let's delve even deeper into specific aspects of Viking culture and society that reveal just how sophisticated and complex this civilization really was. The archaeological record continues to yield discoveries that challenge every preconception about medieval European capabilities and demonstrate that Viking societies achieved levels of technological, artistic, and organizational sophistication that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. The recent excavations at Rib in Denmark, for example, have revealed one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated urban centres, with evidence of international trade connections, specialised craft production, and administrative organisation that dates back to the early 8th century, before the traditional start of the Viking Age. This discovery forces us to reconsider our understanding of how Viking expansion developed, suggesting that it emerged from already sophisticated urban commercial centres, rather than from purely rural agricultural societies. The workshop areas discovered at Ribe show evidence of glass bead production using techniques imported from the Mediterranean, amber working that supplied international luxury markets, textile production using advanced looms and dyeing techniques, and metalworking that produced goods for both local use and international trade. This wasn't a simple trading post, but a sophisticated manufacturing centre that coordinated production and distribution across continental networks. The administrative buildings identified at Ribe demonstrate governmental organisation that was far more complex than traditional accounts of early Scandinavian political development suggest. The standardised construction techniques, the systematic organisation of different functional areas, and the evidence for record-keeping and administrative coordination all point to political institutions that were already sophisticated before Viking expansion began. Similar discoveries at Hedeby, the great trading centre that connected Scandinavia with the broader European world, reveal urban organisation that rivals anything found in medieval Europe. The systematic street planning, the specialised workshop areas, the elaborate harbour facilities, and the defensive systems all demonstrate urban planning and engineering capabilities that required extensive technical knowledge and organisational coordination. The preservation of organic materials at Hedeby provides unprecedented insights into daily life in a Viking trading centre. The leather goods, textile fragments, wooden implements, and food remains show us a society that was remarkably prosperous and sophisticated in its material culture. The quality of craftsmanship, the variety of goods, and the evidence for international trade connections all challenge stereotypes about medieval European living standards. The harbour installations at Hedeby represent some of medieval Europe's most advanced maritime engineering. The systematic construction of piers, the provision for different types of vessels, the integration of defensive and commercial functions, and the sophisticated understanding of tidal and weather patterns all demonstrate engineering capabilities that wouldn't be matched in Northern Europe for centuries. The defensive systems at sites like Hedeby and Birka show military engineering that was remarkably sophisticated and effective. The integration of natural topographic features with artificial fortifications, the systematic provision for different types of attacks, and the coordination between land and naval defensive systems all demonstrate strategic thinking and engineering capabilities that challenge assumptions about medieval military technology. The Danevirke, the massive defensive system that protected Danish territory from southern invasion, represents one of medieval Europe's most impressive engineering achievements. The systematic construction of earthworks, ditches, and palisades across the entire width of the Danish peninsula demonstrates organisational capabilities and engineering knowledge that required coordination among multiple communities and sustained effort over generations. Recent archaeological analysis of the Danevirke has revealed construction techniques and engineering principles that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics, water management, and defensive architecture. The systematic provision for drainage, the integration of different construction materials, and the adaptation to local topographic conditions all show engineering knowledge that was remarkably advanced for its time. The preservation of Viking ships in Scandinavian museums provides ongoing opportunities to study technological achievements that continue to impress modern naval architects and marine engineers. The sophisticated understanding of hull design, the integration of different construction materials, and the optimization for multiple performance characteristics all demonstrate technological capabilities that represented the cutting edge of medieval engineering. The recent reconstruction projects that have built functional replicas of Viking ships using traditional techniques have demonstrated just how sophisticated these vessels really were. Modern sailors using reconstructed Viking ships have achieved speeds and handling characteristics that rival modern sailing vessels, proving that Viking naval technology represented genuine engineering excellence rather than primitive craft techniques. The navigational achievements that enabled Vikings to cross the Atlantic and establish settlements in North America continue to amaze modern navigators and maritime historians. The techniques for celestial navigation, the understanding of weather patterns and ocean currents, and the ability to maintain course accuracy over thousands of miles of open ocean all demonstrate knowledge and skills that few modern sailors can match. The discovery of the Unitok disk in Greenland, which appears to be a sophisticated navigational instrument, suggests that Viking navigation involved more advanced technology than previously suspected. The mathematical principles embodied in the disk's construction demonstrate understanding of trigonometry and celestial mechanics that wouldn't be matched in European navigation for centuries. The settlements that Vikings established in Iceland, Greenland, and North America represent remarkable achievements in medieval colonization that demonstrate planning, resource management, and adaptive capabilities that few medieval societies could match. The systematic transportation of livestock, agricultural implements, and household goods across thousands of miles of dangerous ocean required logistical capabilities that were extraordinary for their time. The agricultural adaptations that Viking settlers achieved in marginal environments like Iceland and Greenland demonstrate remarkable understanding of soil management, climate adaptation, and sustainable resource use. The development of farming techniques that could succeed in subarctic conditions while supporting substantial populations shows environmental knowledge and adaptive capabilities that were exceptional even by modern standards. The preservation of wooden artifacts in waterlogged archaeological sites throughout the former Viking territories provides unique insights into technological capabilities that are rarely preserved in other medieval contexts. The sophisticated joinery techniques, the advanced tool design, and the artistic accomplishment of wooden objects all demonstrate craft traditions that were remarkably sophisticated and artistically accomplished. The textile remains that have been preserved in Viking graves and settlements reveal clothing and household fabrics that demonstrate advanced weaving techniques, sophisticated dyeing methods, and artistic design that rivals the best medieval European textile production. The complexity of weaving patterns, the variety of materials used, and the sophistication of decorative techniques all show textile traditions that were highly developed and artistically sophisticated. The metalworking achievements of Viking craftsmen continue to impress modern metallurgists and materials scientists. The sophisticated understanding of alloy composition, the advanced forging and finishing techniques, and the artistic accomplishment of decorated metalwork all demonstrate technological capabilities that represented the pinnacle of medieval European achievement. The analysis of Viking Age swords using modern materials science techniques has revealed manufacturing methods that demonstrate understanding of steel composition and heat treatment that wasn't matched in European metalworking for centuries. The systematic control of carbon content, the sophisticated pattern welding techniques, and the precision of tempering and finishing all show technological knowledge that was remarkably advanced. The jewellery and decorative metalwork that Vikings produced demonstrates artistic traditions that were sophisticated both technically and aesthetically. The precision of casting and engraving techniques, the complexity of decorative designs, and the integration of different materials all show artistic capabilities that were exceptional even by the standards of medieval European craftsmanship. The economic systems that Vikings developed to support their expansion represent some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated commercial organizations. The coordination of production, transportation, and distribution across continental distances required financial institutions, communication networks, and administrative systems that were remarkably advanced for their time. The standardization of silver weights and measures across the Viking trading network created one of medieval Europe's most extensive common markets. The systematic relationship between different regional standards, the provision for quality control, and the development of credit and exchange systems all demonstrate economic organization that was sophisticated and effective. The commercial law codes that developed in Viking trading centers provided legal frameworks for international commerce that were more advanced and practical than most medieval European legal systems. The provision for dispute resolution, the standardization of commercial practices, and the integration of different legal traditions all show legal innovation that was remarkably sophisticated. The analysis of silver hoards from the Viking Age provides detailed evidence for trade patterns and commercial relationships that extended from Greenland to Central Asia. The mixing of Islamic, Byzantine, and Western European silver coins in individual hoards demonstrates commercial networks that were truly international in scope and remarkably efficient in operation. The development of credit systems and commercial partnerships that enabled Viking merchants to operate across vast distances demonstrates financial innovation that was centuries ahead of most medieval European commercial practices. The systematic organization of trading expeditions, the coordination of seasonal trading cycles, and the management of commercial relationships across cultural boundaries all show business practices that were sophisticated and effective. The urban development that Vikings initiated in their trading centres and colonial settlements demonstrates city planning and administrative organisation that was remarkably advanced for medieval Europe. The systematic provision for different functional areas, the integration of commercial and residential zones, and the coordination of infrastructure development all show urban planning capabilities that were sophisticated and practical. The political institutions that Vikings developed to govern their expanded territories represent important innovations in medieval European governmental organisation. The integration of traditional Scandinavian political practices with local customs and legal traditions created hybrid governmental systems that were often more effective and equitable than purely traditional alternatives. The legal systems that emerged from Viking expansion created some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated attempts to manage culturally diverse populations within unified political frameworks. The systematic integration of different legal traditions, the development of procedures for cross-cultural dispute resolution, and the creation of hybrid legal institutions all show legal innovation that was remarkably advanced. The educational systems that developed in Viking settlements demonstrate approaches to learning and knowledge transmission that were sophisticated and effective. The preservation of oral traditions, the systematic training of skilled craftsmen, and the development of literary and historical traditions all show educational practices that were advanced for their time. The religious developments that occurred during the Christianization of Viking societies created some of medieval Europe's most interesting examples of cultural integration and religious innovation. The systematic preservation of traditional elements within Christian frameworks, the development of distinctive theological traditions, and the creation of new forms of religious expression all show religious creativity that was sophisticated and lasting. The artistic traditions that developed during the Viking Age represent some of medieval Europe's most distinctive and accomplished cultural achievements. The integration of traditional Scandinavian decorative motifs with influences from across the expanded Viking world created artistic traditions that were sophisticated both technically and aesthetically. The literary achievements of the Viking Age, particularly the saga literature produced in medieval Iceland, represent some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated and psychologically complex narrative works. The systematic preservation of historical traditions, the development of narrative techniques, and the creation of literary works that combined entertainment with historical and legal functions all show cultural achievements that were remarkable for their time. The scientific and technical knowledge that Vikings accumulated through their extensive travels and diverse economic activities contributed to medieval European understanding in fields ranging from astronomy and navigation to agriculture and natural history. The systematic observation of natural phenomena, the development of practical applications for scientific knowledge, and the preservation and transmission of technical information all show intellectual achievements that were important and lasting. As we reach the conclusion of our comprehensive examination of 4 centuries of Viking history, we can see that the conventional image of Vikings as simple raiders and pirates completely fails to capture the reality of one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated and influential civilizations. The evidence for technological innovation, artistic achievement, political sophistication, commercial organization, and cultural creativity demonstrates that Viking societies were among the most advanced and capable of their time. The scale and scope of Viking achievements become even more remarkable when we consider that they were accomplished by populations that never exceeded a few million people operating with medieval technology and organizational capabilities. The efficiency with which Vikings converted limited human and material resources into historical influence that spanned continents and lasted for centuries represents one of history's most impressive examples of strategic effectiveness and cultural creativity. The adaptability that Vikings demonstrated in adjusting their methods and objectives to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential cultural identity provides important lessons about how societies can successfully navigate periods of rapid change and increased competition. The systematic evolution from raiding to trading to political integration that characterized Viking expansion shows strategic thinking and institutional innovation that remain relevant today. The cultural achievements that Vikings accomplished while simultaneously conducting military campaigns, establishing settlements, and managing commercial networks demonstrate intellectual and artistic capabilities that few societies have matched under any circumstances. The creation of sophisticated literature, the development of advanced legal systems, the production of remarkable artistic works, and the preservation of extensive historical traditions all occurred during periods of active expansion and cultural transformation. The technological innovations that Vikings developed and transmitted throughout their expansion areas contributed to European technological advancement in ways that influenced the later development of European civilization and global expansion. The shipbuilding techniques, navigational methods, metalworking processes, and organizational innovations that Vikings pioneered provided foundations for European technological development that remained influential for centuries. The political innovations that Vikings developed for governing conquered territories and integrating diverse populations provided important precedents for later European political development and colonial expansion. The legal systems, administrative techniques, and governmental institutions that Vikings created demonstrated possibilities for political organization that influenced European political thinking throughout the medieval period and beyond. The economic innovations that Vikings developed created some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated commercial networks and financial systems. The standardization of commercial practices, the development of international trade networks, the creation of financial institutions, and the establishment of legal frameworks for commercial activity all contributed to European economic development in ways that provided foundations for later European commercial expansion and global trade. The social innovations that Vikings developed for managing culturally diverse populations provided important models for European societies that were themselves becoming more diverse and cosmopolitan through trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. The techniques for cultural integration, the development of hybrid institutions, and the creation of shared identities that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries all influenced European social development in lasting ways. The religious innovations that emerged from the Christianization of Viking societies contributed to medieval European Christian development in ways that influenced the evolution of European Christianity and its expansion beyond Europe. The integration of traditional and Christian elements, the development of distinctive theological traditions, and the creation of new forms of Christian expression all enriched European religious culture and provided models for Christian development in other cultural contexts. The intellectual innovations that emerged from Viking expansion contributed to medieval European intellectual development in ways that influenced European scholarly traditions and educational methods throughout the medieval period and beyond. The historical methodology, legal scholarship, literary techniques, and scientific knowledge that Vikings developed and preserved provided important contributions to European intellectual culture that remained influential for centuries. The linguistic innovations and influences that resulted from Viking expansion created permanent changes in European languages that continue to shape communication and cultural expression today. The vocabulary, grammatical structures, and literary traditions that emerged from the interaction between Scandinavian and other European languages enriched European linguistic culture and provided foundations for later European cultural development. In our final assessment of the Viking Age, we must recognize that we are examining not just a period of Scandinavian expansion, but a crucial phase in the development of European civilization itself. The political institutions, economic systems, cultural traditions, technological capabilities, and intellectual achievements that emerged from 4 centuries of Viking activity provided essential foundations for the European civilization that would later expand globally and profoundly influence world history. The Vikings didn't just raid, trade, and settle. They helped create the intellectual, technological, and institutional foundations that made later European global expansion possible. The organizational capabilities, technological innovations, commercial practices, and cultural institutions that Vikings developed provided essential precedents and practical knowledge that later European societies employed in their own expansion efforts. Understanding Viking history means understanding how European civilization actually developed, rather than how we might prefer to think it developed. It was not a peaceful process of gradual improvement guided by Christian virtue and classical wisdom alone. It was a complex, often violent, always competitive process in which success belonged to societies that could adapt quickly, fight effectively, organize efficiently, and integrate successfully with their neighbors and enemies. The Vikings succeeded because they understood this reality and shaped their society to take advantage of it. Their descendants succeeded because they recognized when the rules of the game were changing and adapted accordingly while preserving the core capabilities that had made their ancestors successful. The societies that couldn't or wouldn't make similar adaptations found themselves marginalized or eliminated by more adaptive competitors. The Viking Age teaches us that historical success belongs not to the most virtuous societies, but to the most adaptable ones. The Vikings weren't necessarily better people than their contemporaries. They were more flexible, more opportunistic, and more willing to abandon comfortable traditions when those traditions became obstacles to success rather than sources of strength. This lesson remains profoundly relevant today as we face our own periods of rapid technological change, increased global competition, and uncertain futures. The societies that succeed in our contemporary world are not necessarily those with the largest populations, the greatest natural resources, or the most stable cultural traditions, but those that can adapt most quickly and effectively to changing circumstances while maintaining the core capabilities that make them competitive. The 4 centuries of Viking history we have examined represent one of humanity's most remarkable examples of how strategic vision, organizational effectiveness, technological innovation, and cultural adaptability can enable relatively small societies to achieve historical influences that far exceed what their demographic and resource base would suggest possible. The legacy of these achievements continues to shape our world today in ways that we are still discovering and learning to understand. From the political institutions of the modern Scandinavian nations to the legal traditions of the English-speaking world, from the commercial practices of international trade to the literary traditions of European culture, the innovations and achievements of the Viking Age continue to influence human civilization more than a millennium after the traditional end of the Viking period. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking Age demonstrates that human societies are capable of remarkable achievements when they combine strategic intelligence with cultural creativity, technological innovation with organizational effectiveness, and local identity with global engagement. The Vikings created one of history's most successful examples of how small societies can achieve great things when they refuse to be constrained by conventional limitations and are willing to pursue their objectives with intelligence, courage, and strategic vision. Their story continues to inspire and inform us today, providing enduring testimony to the human capacity for achievement, adaptation, and cultural creativity even under the most challenging circumstances. In an era when we face our own challenges of global competition, technological change, and cultural transformation, the example of the Vikings reminds us that success belongs to those who can combine tradition with innovation, local identity with global engagement, and strategic thinking with the courage to pursue ambitious objectives despite uncertain outcomes. The 400 years of Viking history stand as one of humanity's great success stories, a testament to what can be accomplished when human intelligence, courage, and creativity are channeled through effective institutions and strategic vision toward the achievement of ambitious but carefully planned objectives. It is a legacy that continues to enrich and inspire human civilization today, more than 1,000 years after the last Viking longship disappeared beyond the horizon. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.